This is something to talk about with the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Howard Emery, and he's going to talk to us about migratory birds. Morning, Howard.
Why, thank you so much. I really appreciate being invited, and I think we're going to have a good time this morning. So, Bob, if you could put the introductory slide up, I guess you call them picture up anyway. So this travelogue for the birds is centered on one of the most dramatic displays of nature that I have ever seen. This is the spring migration of the lesser Sandhill Cranes, which fly through central Nebraska and roost along the Platte River for 2 to 3 weeks in order to rest and refuel on their spring migration north. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll get started. All right, Sandhill Cranes. This crane species is native to North America. They are the most successful crane species in the world. There are several thousand resident cranes who live in North America and a little bit of northern Mexico part of the year. The other native North American species of crane is the whooping crane, which is a more dramatic bird and but much more endangered. Next slide is going to show the lesser Santial Crane spends the winter. Now, do we have the picture of the diagram of the map of the lower part of the U.S. and
yes,
yeah,
there's a large light blue area in the lower section in the middle. That's where the lesser Santial Cranes spend the winter. They are mostly in Texas and northern Mexico. There's a few in southern Arizona and southern New Mexico, and a little bit on the Louisiana border. Then there are some other light blue areas in Florida and another one in California. And those are other subspecies of the Santial Crane, which we'll get to later. So these birds spend the winter in this lower part of the country, and then in the spring they begin to get restless, and they begin to form flocks, and they change their eating behavior, and they start overeating food that's gonna give them increased subcutaneous fat, and they need this fat for energy when they're doing the migration. They're going to use this to migrate to their. I have it. That's not a problem. To migrate to their nesting grounds in the north. The next slide will show in pink. There's a darker pink area along the southern part of Canada where they regroup again, but then they go on all through Canada and Alaska, and actually some of them go across the Bering Sea and go into Siberia to nest. And these birds will lay their eggs, raise their children, teach them how to take care of themselves, teach them how to fly, because within 4 or 5 months after the eggs hatch, these birds will be able to fly back to the winter nesting grounds, wintering grounds in the southern states. Here's a small flock of lesser Santial Cranes that we saw in Homer, Alaska, on a trip a number of years ago. So this is one of the places in Alaska where they breed. Homer is just a little bit southwest of Anchorage. But they go all the way up to the northern part of Alaska and Canada as well. Next slide shows a diagram outline of the state of Nebraska. And here you see in orange the areas where the Sandhill Cranes have their stopover when they stop to rest and refuel. Mostly along this section of the river that curves around here toward the south. There are a few other small areas where they collect in the springtime. So they will start arriving in early March, and throughout March and part of April, typically 650,000 birds will stop in this area, and many of them at the same time. And it's quite a dramatic, scene. This shows the pathway in the southern states, the wintering area. You can't see my cursor moving, so in the lower states, the wintering area in the narrowest part of this is only about 80 miles wide, which goes through central Nebraska, and that's the area that we're talking about initially. And then from there, they go on up to the nesting areas, which cover a large part of the northern part of our world. Santial Cranes are named for their most well-known annual migration stop, which is among the sandhills of central Nebraska. The reason this works is because the Platte River is spread out, shallow and spread out, so that there are places where the birds can spend the night and feel safe. And they do that standing in the water. But the Platte River has to be managed in order to maintain. But this is, if you read stories about the Oregon Trail and the wagons, covered wagons going across the West, you'll remember that they were able to just drive the wagons right through the Platte River because it's so spread out and shallow in this area. But this is ideal for the cranes. The other thing that makes it ideal is that the cranes have, well, I can't go to that. So are we seeing the slide with the river and the sandy flats?
Yes.
Okay. So the next slide is going to show that the cranes go to stay overnight in the water. And they do this for safety. They feel like this gives them more warning if the predators start to come after them. So they choose a place. They like to have the water not come up over their ankles, but just enough to give them safety, and then they need to have an open space around them so that they can see any predators coming from a distance. And this is where they spend the night. In the next slide, which is a close-up of the birds in the water, you can see that they stand here and they sleep here all night. You can't see the detail here, but some of them they sleep standing on one leg. They fold the other leg up underneath their wing in order to keep it warm because the water's cold. And they also have another mechanism which is really helpful, and that is that they're able to control the blood supply to their leg, so they can improve the circulation to their leg, having more warm blood come down into that leg that's in the water. And in addition to that, because the leg is you can see the leg is very narrow, the warm blood in the artery helps to warm the cold blood that's coming back up to the body and through the vein. And because the artery and the vein are close together, by the time the blood gets back up into the body, it's beginning to be warmed up again, and that allows them to sleep comfortably in the water all night. During spring migration, the morning awakens at dawn, and you can hear the cranes beginning to speak as they awake. And that when it's just beginning to get light, and hearing the cranes is just such a dramatic sound. And then the next slide, it's like a cloud rising off the river. Thousands of birds come into the air and spread out over the land that's around them. And here they go to, of course, there's a little bit of corn in Nebraska, where they have a bunch of corn huskers. So there are a lot of fields that have wasted corn, or like the biblical gleaning of the fields. And the birds, this is where the birds feed. They feed on grain. They feed on small insects and small amphibians, and they're omnivorous. In the late afternoon and evening, the birds begin to return to the river. As the sun is setting, literally thousands of cranes converge over the river. And the sky overhead is filled with birds. And at sunset, the stragglers arrive, and you can see them coming in with the last bit of light. Habitat preservation along the Platte River is central to the conditions that support this migratory pattern. A lot of work has been done for many years, actually, to maintain the Platte River, at least this section of the Platte River, in a condition that is conducive to this migratory pattern. Part of this is related to National Wildlife Refuge System. In 1903, Teddy Roosevelt started the first National Wildlife Refuge on Pelican Island in Florida. And there are now over 500 wildlife refuges in the system throughout the country. And these areas are designated to be managed to maintain appropriate habitat for endangered species primarily. This is coordinated through the Endangered Species Act. So there are 4 endangered species in the Platte River that allow this to be part of the refuge system. However, the Santial Cranes in their thousands, of course, are not considered endangered at all. But the whooping crane, who do fly with them occasionally, is one of the endangered species that this area is helping to protect. And in addition to the refuge system, then, the local Audubon Society and the local community recognize that what a wonderful national treasure this is. And obviously it's an economic benefit to them as well, to have increased tourism. And so since the Platte River flows through 3 states, it comes out of the Rockies in Colorado. It goes through a section of Wyoming before it comes into Nebraska, going through Nebraska, and then it empties into the Missouri River. And so the refuge system is not enough to protect this whole thing, that whole distribution. And so there is in the last 20 years or so, they formed the Platte River Preservation Program. And this program coordinates between those 3 states. They have a fairly complex program. It includes controlling the flow in the river, so that there are several dams along the river and they can control the water flow through the dams. It includes working with local farmers and governmental agencies to apportion irrigation water to...
Howard, I'm currently showing slide 18. Where should I be, please?
This is background right now, so I have no other slide for this. So yeah, if we can just hang on with this for a minute, we'll get to the next slide. Is that all right?
Okay. All right. I just wanted to make sure I'm in the right place.
No, thank you. Thank you. So coordinating the water flow is really requires cooperation from multiple individuals and agencies. Sections along the river, the wetlands around the river have been purchased by this program, and then once a year they open up 1 or more dams and allow a heavy flow of spring meltwater to come down the river in such force that it will keep the vegetation from growing on these sand flats, so that it maintains its spread out shallow nature. And this has been very successful in the last 20 years. Now we can go to the next slide. So Audubon has a center on the banks of the river, and you can see the building here that's on the left-hand side of your picture with a large, headquarters, lecture room, gift shop, all the usual stuff. I think you can even get a snack shop there. And then there's a trail that goes along the river. And if you follow, in this picture, you follow the trail up toward the top right. You can't really notice it too much. But in that section of the river that is blue up on near the top right are some bird blinds. And the next picture shows something about what it's like to be in the bird blinds. So the bird blinds are right on the river, and when the cranes are coming in at night, standing in the water, getting ready to leave in the morning, coming and going during the day to some extent. It's a very dramatic place to be able to watch them coming and going. Cranes form mating partnerships for life. During the spring migration, on arrival at the nesting grounds in the north, they perform, we're going to go to the next slide now, mating dances. Here the male tries to show off his strength and agility. And apparently the females are impressed. They agree to work together, and they actually make a nest by building a shallow cup of grass, usually on the ground, sometimes in plants, even over the water. And then the next slide shows the nest with the mother bird on it. I don't think I mentioned that the male and female markings are the same, so you can't really distinguish male from female in the adult birds. But here's the shallow nest that and they typically lay 2 eggs, and the incubation period is about 30 days. And then in 30 days, the next slide will show that they have a couple of little chicks. Can we see that all right?
Oh, yeah.
So these chicks are called colts for some reason. But they are pretty cute, I have to say.
They're adorable. They're so downy looking.
So over the next 3 to 4 months, they will teach the chicks are able to swim and walk immediately after the eggs are hatched. But of course, they have to be fed, and they have to be taught how to feed themselves. And over the next 3 or 4 months, they will grow in size, of course. And here's one that's not quite ready to fly, but they get to the within 4 months, they get to the place where they can fly back to the winter grounds with their adult parents. Then going south, there's no slide for this, but going south, the fall migration is much less dramatic because the birds tend to travel in small groups. They don't really stop and spend any time along the Platte River. They may stop there overnight, but going south, they're going to warmer areas. They don't need to stock up on food in order to survive the trip north, and so the southern migration is much less dramatic.
Looks like a teenager.
This is a yeah. definitely an adolescent. Okay, the Sandhill Crane is one of the largest breeding birds in North America. That's the next slide. It ranges from 3.5 to 5 feet tall with a wingspan of up to 7 feet.
Wow.
Bird plumage, both male and female, is tan, often with a mottled appearance. The top of the head to the base of the bill is red, and then there's a white chin. They live an average of 20 to 40 years.
Wow.
Yeah. They make the largest population of any of the 15 species of cranes in the world. The majority of the worldwide cranes are endangered, with a few birds surviving due to hunting and loss of habitat. The other crane species are in Asia, Africa, and I think there's one small species in Europe that make up the rest of the worldwide crane population. One of the what happened here? One of the interesting things about cranes, which makes them easier to identify in the field, is the fact that when they fly, they have their neck out straight. And this is quite different than what we have around here, which of course are much more common for us, and that is the herons. This is a great blue heron, and they fly with their neck, with their head folded back so that the neck's folded at quite an angle. And that makes it a little easier to identify them from a distance.
Mhm.
There are several subspecies of sandhill cranes. The lesser sandhill crane is by far the largest population, but there are a couple of populations. There's one in Cuba and one in Florida that are that do not migrate, that they're endemic, and they're residential, I think is the term they use, and so they stay in the same place all year round. And then there are on this map. Oh, I'm sorry. Next slide. You should have a map of the outline of the U.S.
Yes.
And it shows on Florida is yellow with hatch marks on it. There's an area in northern Mexico, lower Texas, or New Mexico, which has the same markings, and another area over in California in the San Joaquin Valley. And these areas have the one in California in particular is the greater Sandhill crane, which is slightly larger than the lesser Sandhill crane, but not a whole lot different. But they don't intermingle that much. And the California cranes, along with some smaller populations that occur in Oregon and even in eastern Washington or central Washington, around Mount Adams and around east of Yakima, in a little town called Othello, which I had never heard of until I started looking into this. But there's a small crane, greater Sandhill crane population there, and so and then some of the migratory cranes, the ones from California, do not go to the Platte River at all. They go north. Some of them go to the Klamath Wildlife Refuge, which is in Klamath Falls on the lower Oregon, northern California border. And then you can see the blue areas where they let's see, I can't read it. Oh yeah, these are areas where they congregate during breeding season. The green is where I'm sorry. Let's go back to the beginning. Unlike the lesser Santial cranes, most of these birds will summer, breed, nest, raise their young in central Canada. And that's the green area here. There are some that that do their breeding in Wisconsin and a few of them stay in eastern Washington for breeding. So you may find and then there are a few in the Skagit Valley north of us here. So we should be able to see cranes once in a while if we were, but not in the huge numbers that we were talking about earlier. And then there's one other species of crane, which is the next slide, and that's the whooping crane. And it's slightly larger than even the greater Santial crane, but similar size. Spectacular all-white bird. It was widespread through the eastern United States in the 1800s, and in 1870, the bird count reported that there were about 1,400 whooping cranes in the U.S. By 1930, there were less than 50. And so a major effort was done in conservation to try to prevent these birds from going extinct.
Was it from a loss of habitat mostly, Howard?
Well, certainly that part of that, but actually, one of my earlier talks, I talked about using bird plumage for women's hats.
Oh,
and so that's part of because of these birds had such spectacular plumage. That was part of it. So part of it was hunting, part of it was loss of habitat. Definitely,
yes.
Yeah. And so a residential area in Florida began to raise whooping cranes, and they did not migrate at all. And then this was in the 19th, but in the middle part of the 20th century, and then they began to take some of these birds and move them to other parts of the country. And over the last 80 years, they're now the count in 2019. The International Crane Association reported there were 820 whooping cranes. So the population recovery has been quite successful.
That's wonderful.
They mostly the populations now spend most of them, the largest number of them, I should say, nest and raise their young in central Canada, and they spend the winter on the Gulf Coast of Texas. So that's their migratory pathway. And then there's another area in Wisconsin, a crane center that where some of them raise their young there and nest there, and then they go back to Florida for the winter.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like being in New York City, I guess.
Snowbirds.
And then, of course, there are a number of zoos. The number of zoos that have whooping cranes to show off. So, how do birds decide? Let's go to the next slide. How do birds decide where to migrate? This is a demonstration of what are called flyways. Worldwide, there are quite a number of flyways, which are pattern, which are areas where majority of birds typically migrate. In the U.S., there are 4 flyways. What we've been talking about with Nebraska is part of the Central Flyway, and so Nebraska would be in about here, and this is defined by being east of the Rockies and through the Central Plains. Then there's the Mississippi Flyway, which of course goes along the Mississippi River Delta Valley and associated water that's around the Mississippi River. The Atlantic Flyway, and then the Pacific Flyway. The majority is closer to the coast, west of the Cascades, although there are some part of the Pacific Flyway that goes east of the Sierras and the Cascades, and that you can see spread out as well. So these are the 4 major pathways that birds use to migrate. The pathways have some obvious characteristics. They tend to avoid mountain ranges. They are often close to bodies of water where birds can get some water, or a lot of the migrating birds are water birds. They are, and then wetlands with insects and amphibians and plants even that are in the wetlands are oftentimes used for birds for feeding. So these are the things that determine where a pathway will be formed. Many of the smaller birds, in particular the tanagers and the vireos and the warblers, winter in Central America and South America. So you can see along the Pacific Flyway in dark blue, birds going to Central America and South America, and the Central Flyway as well in yellow. The Eastern Flyways, particularly the Atlantic Flyway, goes over. It's a little bit misleading from this map, but are we on the next map? I guess maybe I didn't say that.
Are we?
Are we still on the 4 flyways? Or are we?
Yeah, we have the 4 still. You want to go to the next one?
Yeah, please, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. So you can see the dark blue is the Pacific Flyway, going into Central America, where a lot of the birds spend the winter. The Atlantic Flyway on the violet. It's a little misleading because of the way the diagram's built, but a lot of that's over the Caribbean, and that's sometimes several hundred miles across for birds that come from the East Coast. And then we're going to go to the next slide. Over 1 billion birds from approximately 4,000 species, or about 40% of the world's birds, do long-distance migration. Migration has been studied extensively. It's a fascinating subject. Causes and mechanisms which control migration are some of the most fascinating and puzzling phenomena in the natural world. How do they decide when to get ready to go? How do they decide where to go? How do they navigate? I mean, all these questions are really interesting to look at. One of the central a central question certainly is why do they migrate? And there seems to be an advantage for raising their young because of the increased length of the day, the increased amount of sunlight, and the subsequent increase in insect life and plant life. So that birds, there are some birds who parts of the population will breed closer to the equator than others. And those that breed closer to the equator typically will have two eggs, which hatch to become young. Those that migrate, the same species that migrate in the far north, will have 4 to 5 young. And even though there are risks from migration, from predators, from exhaustion, from running out of fuel, and from windstorms, from all kinds of things, power lines, and there's still an advantage to them to fly to where the day is longer and they have more ways that they can feed their young.
Right.
One of the things that is also interesting is that the birds feed before they start migration. So, shoot. Sorry, I got shoot. Okay. Oh, yes. So one of the things that happens is it's not clear what triggers this, but birds begin to produce different hormones in the spring, even though there's no relationship, there's not a direct relationship, obviously, between the conditions in the southern states or Mexico and where they're going in Alaska. Even still on the wintering grounds, their hormones begin to change. They begin to have more, the sexual hormones develop, and they begin to feed more in order to create stores of fat, which give them the energy then that they can fly long distances. So some of these birds will be able to double their weight in 3 weeks during this period of time when they're preparing to be able to get ready to migrate. This bird, and then let's go to the next slide now. This bird is the great snipe. Probably some of us who are old enough to remember when we were kids and we were out camping, somebody would send you off on a snipe hunt.
Yes.
Well, this is what a snipe looks like.
Your parents wanted to get rid of you.
And they do actually occur. But this bird will store up enough fat. And then this bird has one of the longest distance migrations. It's over 4,000 miles. It will fly at 60 miles an hour, over 4,000 miles nonstop. And in doing that, it will reduce its weight then by half, and that extra weight is all used up in that exuberant use of energy. There are some other hard to believe stories about bird migration. The next slide shows the Arctic tern. The Arctic tern spends the winter at the South Pole. The Arctic tern spends the summer at the North Pole. And it doesn't even fly directly from one in a straight line. So that it's been studied, I guess, that they will fly over 40,000 miles in a year between poles and back. And then we can go to the next slide. Another intriguing aspect of migration is the question of how do birds navigate. Much of the migration occurs at night, and they may be able to use the stars for direction. Some people feel that they may be sensitive to magnetic fields. Multiple studies of this behavior are underway and have been done for quite a number of years. But it's still not clear as to exactly all of the factors that are involved. There are stories of young birds who start out with their parents on a migration. They're caught in a banding, in bird nets to be banded. And then the adults are allowed to continue the migration, where the young birds are kept back for a week or two and then released, and they will follow the adults, even though they've never been on that road. They've never been to that area before. They will be able to fly and join their parents because there's something intrinsic in the direction that they're going that allows them to know where they're intended to go. It's fascinating to speculate as to how that works.
It's a mystery.
It is a mystery to me. And I think reading the literature, a little bit the literature that I've read, it seems like there's still a lot of controversy over to how they do that.
All right.
Once the migrants are loaded with food and ready to go, they wait for the weather to fire their starting gun. A spell of calm weather with clear skies is usually the signal. And we are fortunate to be able to be observers of bird migration here, especially in the Skagit Valley north of us, and other places around the country, of course, even more dramatically. So please enjoy the migratory birds.